What's up, everybody out there? We're back. Hacker Heroes episode number 3 is on. And in today's episode, I am going to have an exciting guest, and I'm speaking of Tom Hudson, aka Tom Nom Nom. So let's jump straight into the interview. Hi everyone, today we're here with Tom Hudson. And if you are asking yourself right now, who is Tom Hudson? You might know him a little bit better under his name, Tom Nom Nom. Hey Tom, how's it going?
It's going okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being on the show with us today. Maybe can you tell me straight away, where is Tom Nom Nom coming from, this nickname of yours?
I was given it by a co-worker some years ago. I think partly because I love to eat, and partly because I'm called Tom. But I think her slightly strange origin. So there was a really cheap, junky electronic toy frog that we had in the office where I used to work that went om nom nom nom. And a good friend of mine, a chap called Rob, who had this frog, kind of developed it into Tom Nom 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 Nom. But there was too many noms for me, so I shortened it to Tom Nom Nom. But I think it passes the test of a nickname that I didn't come up with it myself.
And it is an awesome nickname, and it is super well known by now in the community, I guess. So that was a good choice. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I'm Tom, as we talked about. I currently work for Detectify as a security researcher. But before that, I was a tactical trainer for a big gambling company in the UK. Done a bunch of other stuff before that. So I was a solutions architect, lead software engineer. Before that, I was a DevOps sort of a person. Before that, was a software engineer, and before that, was kind of software engineer, writing PHP for a company that builds educational software. A whole bunch of stuff before that as well. In terms of how I go into the security side of things, that was through Bug Bounty, pretty much. So I was never professionally a security person up until now. I just kind of found my way here.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when was it then that you heard about the term Bug Bounty for the first time?
I think it was sometime around 2016, 2017, something like that. So the company I was working for at the time launched a Bug Bounty program.
Oh, nice.
I'd never heard of it. I was like, well, this sounds too good to be true. I very much of the age where I grew up with the internet and with the knowledge that if somebody's going to give you money for something on the internet, it's probably a scam. So I would have been really pretty wary of it if it wasn't for the fact that it was my employer doing it. And they, much to my delight, decided that employees could take part in the Bug Bounty program as long as they weren't submitting bugs against code that they wrote. That was the number one rule. And I got involved that way. It was sort of I think I had a wedding booked and not paid for. And here was this thing saying, hey, you can make some money doing something that I happen to be okay at. And the rest is history, as they say.
Exactly. That's awesome. It's sweet to hear that basically Bug Bounty for you gained a little more credibility because your employer actually started setting up a program. So am I right to assume that the first bug that you have submitted then was to your old company, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I had this really big advantage that I knew the code base for the stuff that I was looking at. Access to source code as well, which is always really useful.
A little bit.
Yeah. Not always as useful as you might think. I had conversations back then of people saying, oh, but you've got access to the source code, that's cheating. And I was like, yeah, you've got access to the source code of WordPress. Why aren't you finding tons of bugs there,
That's it. Yeah, that's a good call.
there's tons of open source software that people are not finding so many bugs in. So, source code analysis and that kind of thing is a skill unto itself. It's a different skill to doing that sort of black box penetration testing style hunting. But, nonetheless, I've been a professional software engineer for the best part of a decade. So I was pretty good at reading source code by that point.
Right.
And I went off and found some bugs.
Can you give away what the first bug was that you found, or is that a company secret?
I can give you the sort of slightly redacted version.
Yeah,
so,
that'd be great.
I found an endpoint that let me do sort of a combined LFI and SSRF. So if you're familiar with PHP, this is a sort of a file get contents sort of scenario where it'll work for local files, but also work for HTTP and all those sorts of things, provided those options are turned on. So I was able to read configuration files off disk to get the credentials for an internal API, which I could then call using the same endpoint. So that was pretty cool, and it was a really big rush as well. It's like, wow, I found this terrible thing. And I had to really sort of try and tone down my excitement as I was explaining it to the guys in the security team.
And I can tell that you already had a lot of experience at this point, because that's not really the typical beginner bug that you find in the first place. That's already a good sophisticated one over there. So let's stick to bug bounties for a little bit. I'm wondering, how many hours do you spend on bug bounties these days?
It varies quite dramatically depending on mood and free time and that sort of thing. Often the answer these days is 0, sadly. Full-time job, working in security. I've got 2 kids and plenty of other things to do. But I try and get a couple of hours a week in. Don't usually find anything these days because I'm just exploring and happily looking around and figuring out how things work. But when I get into it, it can be many tens of hours a week, and certainly has been in the past. I a few years ago was probably pushing 30 hours a week on top of a job, intermittently at least.
Yeah, I see though that it's getting more complicated in your phase of life with kids. I'm not having kids at this point, so we'll see how it turns out for me later in my life. Tom, one of the reasons why I'm super excited to have you on the show today is because you're obviously a creator of a lot of tools. And a lot of bug bounty hunters have used your tools in the past, and they're still using them at the time of us speaking right now. So one question that I have to you is, how did you start coming up with the idea that you want to create tools for the community?
I kind of fell into it almost by accident, really. So as I mentioned, spent quite a long time as a software engineer, but also in sort of DevOps and sysadmin sort of roles. So I was pretty used to just automating and scripting the things that I was doing. Even if it was a relatively small task, because I had a decent amount of programming experience, it would be usually faster to script something.
Yeah.
Even if I was only going to do it once. Most of the time I'd have to do it maybe a few times to make it worthwhile. But still, actually scripting or programming something, make sure that you really, really understand it. So I would often still do things that way. And if it's something that's going to affect like a production system, it provides pretty good documentation of exactly what it was that you did as well, which is pretty useful. So when I first started doing Bug Bounty, I downloaded Burp Suite Community, as I think a lot of people did, and I saw how many tabs there were. And because I was new to the scene, I didn't understand all the terminology and stuff, so I closed it pretty quickly. And started playing with the things that I did know how to use. So my really early bug bounty hunting was basically done with Chrome and stuff in the command line, just standard tools like curl, because where I needed to modify a request or something like that. So literally, DevTools, Network Inspector in Chrome, copy as curl for some complicated request based in the terminal, and then play around and modify it. That was kind of the early stuff I was doing. And after a while, I sort of realized that there were things I wanted to do that there didn't seem to be tools for. So one of my very early tools was one called Meg. And the whole idea around Meg was, there was tools like Dirtbuster, for example, to look for lots of paths on a single host. And I was like, well, I kind of want to look for one path on lots of hosts instead. And that didn't really seem to exist at the time, at least, not from the Googling that I did. Probably did, almost certainly not an original idea. Someone else will have done it first, but so I said, I'm going to build my own. Partly because I like building tools as well. And, I saw no reason to keep it private, if that makes sense. I often find myself talking to people about things they've done, and it's way, way easier if I can say, here's a link to some source code so you can see exactly what I mean, instead of just, trying to describe what something is. I find that much easier. Because, it's not private, I thought I'll just put it on GitHub. But a few people started using it. Some sort of early advocates of it, like Ed Overflow, for example, who I chatted to quite a lot. Met him in Vegas, my first live hacking event, which was sort of the time that I kind of got into the bug bounty community, as it were. No one knew who I was at all when I went to that event. And then I met people. And started joining Bug Bounty Forum, Slack, and all that sort of thing. Started talking to people there,
and they loved your tool, right?
Yeah, or at least a few people did. And then I started writing more. As I did more and more Bug Bounty, I found more and more situations where there wasn't a tool that did exactly what I wanted, or at least there wasn't a tool that did what I wanted in the way I wanted. So there's probably a bunch of stuff that my tools do you can do in Burp Suite just fine. But I've been spending my days in a terminal for since fairly early on in my career as a software engineer. So that's where I wanted to be. And I wanted to build these sort of Unix-like tools that do one thing, do it well, but more importantly, that I can compose together with pipes and make them do things I hadn't thought of at the point in time that I wrote them.
Yeah, and I've read a lot of tweets and comments on GitHub whatsoever, where people really appreciate that you're building your tools in that exact way. I'm having a question, which is how do you decide if something is worth its own tool? Because you were saying you're scripting so much. I mean, I assume you have like a gazillion scripts already lying around somewhere on your hard disks, but you only have a certain amount of tools on GitHub. So at which point do you say this gotta be its own tool and I'm going to build something?
So I think the point I decide I'm going to build something is just I need it now. Like I'll build something straight away on the fly. Like as and when I need it. You can build something useful in 20 minutes, for example. I'm not saying that'd be good, but you can build something useful in that time. And for a long time, I kind of kept those things to myself. And if I used them a lot, then I would maybe give them a README file in their own repository. But I found I was doing that more and more, and also had the same thing. I want to talk to somebody about this thing I'd made, but it didn't deserve its own repository. So my equivalent of a collection of scripts on my hard drive became my hacks repository on GitHub. So I have a repo called hacks, and it's hacks in the sort of sense of like a hacky solution rather than like exploits and cool, hacker tools.
Right. It's something dirty rather than a full-fledged tool, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of here's a thing I wrote for my own purposes, and you know what? It's MIT licensed because why not?
Yeah.
So they all go in my hacks repo, and I have a similar sort of gauge for whether something should sort of get its own repository and become its own tool, or a bit more of a first-class citizen. So that'll be either if I use it a whole bunch, or if other people do as well. That's the really great thing about having that repository there is quite a few times over the last couple of years, people have said, I've been using this tool in your hacks repo all the time, and it's been really useful. And by the way, here's some changes I'd really like. But that's the sort of point where I go, okay, well, this should get its own repository, so it's sort of more Googleable and easier to install and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, put out a lot of hacks, what you call them out there, and then see what people really like, and then build the tools from there. No, I like that. Can you walk us a little bit through the process? What's going on in your head from like the first idea to the tools release, and maybe even after that? Like, how does that look like?
Sure. So I would say just about everything I write starts with a problem. And often it will be a case of I'm trying to do this thing as part of doing some bug bounty hunting or something like that. So probably work well if we use an example. So I have a tool called Anew, which is not actually a security tool. It's just sort of a general utility Unix tool. So it's for appending lines to a file, but only if those lines don't already exist in the file. And that's because, in doing my bug bounty hunting, I have dozens and dozens of text files. I have a text file full of domains, and a text file full of URLs, and a text file full of parameters, and so on and so forth. And I don't want duplication in those files. So a real common thing to do would be I'd run let's say a subdomain enumeration tool, find a bunch of subdomains, put them in a file, a text file called domains, and then run that file through sort-u or through sort pipe to unique or something to remove the duplicates. And then sometime later, I stumble across a bunch more subdomains, and I want to add those, from a different subdomain enumeration tool. But then you've got to do the same thing again. And you have to sort of, I'll put them all in the file, and then I will, run them through sort and unique to remove all the duplicates and that sort of thing. But by that point, I've lost a couple of things. So one thing I've lost is I don't know which ones I've added and which ones were duplicates, which is a pretty common thing when you run, say, multiple subdomain enumeration tools.
Absolutely.
The second run might find you 3 extra domains, but actually the output is 300. It's just 297 of them you already had. So I was kind of losing that information in there somewhere. And the other thing, I'm losing the ordering as well. And sometimes the ordering doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. And you want the newest ones you found to be at the bottom of the file or something like that. So I was kind of using a few different tools to solve this problem. And I thought it'd be really neat if I could just solve this with just pipe into one thing. So that was my problem, was it's really cumbersome to perform this task. So I'm going to solve that by writing a tool. And the first version is just going to be something that works. It doesn't have to be elegant. There's not going to be a README or anything. It's going into the hacks repo, and it's going to be effectively, it's a proof of concept. I don't know, does this thing work? Because with a tool like that, I'll immediately try and figure out, is there anything going to stop me from building this tool? And one of the things that I thought was, potentially going to stop me is memory usage. So, for example, the Unix tool Unique only works on a sorted input stream, and that's because they don't want to hold the whole input stream in memory, because that would be wasteful. So I'd always kind of had that sort of assumption baked into my head that it would be a bad thing to do. But I'd never actually, validated it. And one of the things you've got to remember is, these tools were written in the 70s and the 80s. but it's not the 70s and the 80s anymore. I'm dealing with text
Thank
files
God.
that are, maybe a few megabytes in size.
Right.
Maybe they're 50 megabytes in size. I have gigabytes of RAM, so actually, probably it's totally fine to do this, and it turns out, actually is totally fine. So that's the sort of the first to second stage is, have a problem, find some way to solve it, and just come up with a proof of concept. And after that comes the refinements. You find bugs in things, or you find out that your original assumptions weren't valid, maybe, or that it's clunky to use and you need to figure out what the interface is.
Do you get a lot of external pull requests?
I do get quite a few. I've been really bad at dealing with them over the last couple of years or so, which if anyone watching with an open pull request is there, I'm really sorry about that. I basically burnt out a couple of years ago, maybe a bit more than that. And you can see it happen in my GitHub activity thing, with all the green squares. It's like plenty of green, and then it's like, no, this isn't happening. So I've been kind of taken a step back a bit over the last couple of years. But yeah, quite a lot of pull requests. I try and merge the ones that are useful. I find it really hard to say no to pull requests as well, which is, sometimes you've written this laser focused tool that does exactly one thing, and someone shows up and they've spent perhaps hours of time on a pull request to add this feature that you don't need, and you don't think should be in the tool because with some pipes and a bit of IO redirection in Bash, there's no need to do that. So like a real common thing I see is people either asking for or issuing pull requests to add an output file option to my tools, so you can save the output in a file. It's like, I never use that. I always just use Bash IO redirection or a pipe to a new, for example.
Yeah.
And it seems like a really small thing, but when you've written 30 tools, you don't really want to write that code 30 times when you know that it's redundant anyway.
I can imagine. So, Tom, your tool in your GitHub repository, in your GitHub account, and I've checked that prior to this interview, with the most stars is called cron. So why do you think that this is your most, I'm calling it famous tool right now, the most used one, the most starred one at least? And yeah, what is it doing, and what do you think so many people find it useful?
So we should probably start with what it does, I guess. So cron turns JSON into something greppable. So something you can pipe to grep and look for lines in the output and have that output make sense. So, you can grep regular JSON and that's fine. But in particular, if you're dealing with JSON objects with very deep structures, oftentimes if you're looking for a particular value, you get a line of output and all you get is 8 tabs and then the value, and that's your output. And that tells you absolutely nothing about the context in which that value appears in that JSON object. So, I wrote cron to do this transformation where it turns a JSON object into a series of valid JavaScript assignments. So you end up with, instead of just all brackets and things, you end up with something like json.user.email. Square brackets 0 equals mail@example.com or something like that. So you see the full path to that value. And that means if you grep for example.com or you grep for email or something like that, you see that full context, and it helps with the understanding of the structure of that object. And particularly with really large objects, that can make a real difference. I originally wrote it in PHP quite a long time ago now, because I was dealing with an API that had no documentation and returned, 500 kilobyte JSON blobs, and I needed one value that was somewhere in the middle. I was doing quite a lot of that at the time, so same as with just about every other tool that's in there. I had a problem. I wanted to solve it. I wrote this like 25, 30 line PHP script that did it. And I used that a whole bunch. Sometime later, I started getting into the Go programming language and decided I needed, I got past Hello World and all those sort of simpler demo programs, little web server implementation and that sort of thing. And I decided I needed a slightly meatier project to get my teeth into. So I decided I was going to port Gron to Go. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit of a challenge because PHP is dynamically typed, which makes dealing with stuff like JSON very easy because JavaScript also dynamically typed. Go less so. You need to know the type of everything. So it was a really there was a lot of learning in how Go deals with all that sort of thing in importing it, and I got it working. It was pretty good, but I was enjoying myself so much I just kept adding things to it. And I eventually decided at that point it was still a pretty small program, but I decided that what would be really, really cool would be if you could take this output that Gron produces, modify it, and then turn it back into JSON, which you could kind of do a little bit by just piping into a JavaScript file and executing with Node.js. But if you sort of missed any of the steps, like initializing an object or anything like that, it didn't work. So you couldn't really easily perform any kind of transformations on that data and have it work. So I decided to write this parser, basically. This parses a subset of JavaScript and then does some recursive merging of maps and arrays and that sort of thing, and turns the output back into JSON so that you can use it to perform simple transformations and things as well, which is, it's not the kind of thing I'd rely on in an automated script, but doing for sort of manual data munging on the command line turns out to be really useful.
Yeah.
As for how it got popular, I kind of struggle to remember what really happened first. I think, a few people used it and found it useful. I showed it to some people at work and that sort of thing, and tweeted about it a bit, and a few people used it. And I think at some point it ended up on like Hacker News or one of those sorts of sites.
That helps.
And got a bunch more popularity. But even in the pretty early days, I can remember having like a few hundred GitHub stars, which was the most I'd ever had, and going through, and there was like people working at some pretty big companies who had started it and using it. There was like some people at Yelp and some people at Google and that sort of thing. And looking at like the traffic sources on GitHub, I could see there was like some inbound traffic from some people's like corporate chat instances and that sort of thing. So people were sharing it around, just word of mouth. And since then it's been tweets about it have been retweeted by some pretty big accounts, and I think it's been on Hacker News at least one more time. And also, probably the thing I'm most proud of is it's been on Hacker News twice, and the comments weren't completely shitty both times, which I think I almost never see.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I do have one last question to conclude my questions around your tools, and that is, what has been the biggest surprise that has happened to you personally because of your released tools? Because of the attention that you got for your tools?
That's a good question. I think there's not really one single thing. There was a point with Gron, actually, where someone added it to the default Ubuntu repositories.
Oh, nice.
And also it got it to Homebrew, I think, as well. And I think a few other Linux distributions as well. And that was like nothing to do with me.
Okay.
And I think that was a really cool point where it was like, wow, I can install an operating system from, completely bare machine, run sudo apt install run, and a tool that I wrote is right there.
That is pretty neat. Yeah, some really great recognition over there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was like, wow. It's not like installed by default. That would be weird, but it's there. And that was a really, really cool point for me, because that sort of is a bit of validation, right? As this tool that I wrote is actually genuinely useful to people. So I think that was one thing. The other thing that I guess happened, I think largely because of the tools I've written. I think I have the following I have on Twitter and so on, and I think largely because of the tools that I've written, and I'm pretty sure they had a part to play in having the job that I do now. So, like I say, I'm security tech lead for security research at Detectively, and I think going into a job like that without having worked in a security role before is quite unusual. But because I had all of these tools and things and stuff out in the open, there was evidence right here of, I can do this stuff. I don't have to, sit and tell you about the things I wrote in my previous job, but can't show you because, it's all proprietary. So I think when I decided I needed to leave my last job, and sort of put it on Twitter, does anyone want to hire me?
I'm free.
Yeah, exactly. And I got such a good response to that, and I think if I hadn't have written the tools and shared them with people, I don't think that ever would have happened.
Right. No, that is pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit about the place where you're coming from. So you're obviously from the UK, right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious, can you tell us and the audience a little bit about the bug bounty hacking community in the UK? How big is it? Do you get to hang out with a lot of the locals, the local hackers? Just tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I would say the bug bounty community in the UK is fairly small. I think the hacking and InfoSec community is pretty big though. So there's a handful of bug hunters that are pretty well known from the UK. So Katie Paxton Fear, who we chatted about earlier on before we started recording, who is fantastic. She puts out a lot of great content. And there's Zishono as well, who does did do bug bounty notes and now has another project. So we've got Alex and lots of other people, but still, feels like quite a minority compared to the US or India, especially. I mean, obviously the population's much smaller, so you expect that. But the pen tester scene and the hacker scene seems to be super lively in the UK. There's a lot of people I chat with who work for pen test firms, and when there's been events like B-Sides in the UK as well, mm-hmm. It's always packed, and a lot of sort of old school hackers and freakers around as well. We're all sort of, a lot of them are wearing shirts and ties now, but they're still the same people. So I was attending pre-pandemic a local DC meetup at DEF CON user group. So it's DC 151 in Leeds, which is, I think they've just started having their in-person meetups again outside.
Yeah, it's finally coming back, all the great stuff.
Yeah, so there's some really great people there too. I'm really looking forward to being able to go and see all of those people again.
Right.
The talks are always enlightening, and there's some crazy smart people there as well. It's always really tempting to think, all of the really smart people are on Twitter and have a big following. Mm-hmm. And it's really not true at all. Some of the smartest people I've ever met have zero
absolutely, a lot of them
internet footprint at all. They don't have a public GitHub repo, nothing.
Yeah, a lot of the best people in the world, they want to stay completely anonymous, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in our show, we're having a lot of beginners or newcomers to the bug bounty scene, and I want to get back a little bit to bug bounties. Do you have any tips for our watchers? What you do when you approach a new target?
I think probably my main advice is figure out how things work. So, there's a real temptation to jump into trying to exploit stuff. But if you haven't taken the time to understand how a system actually works in the way it's supposed to be working, it can be much harder to spot when things go wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? Like if you don't understand the different types of data that are being passed around, like which token is used for which thing, and as part of the authentication flows, for example, what happens if this particular piece of data is exposed? Is this piece of data sensitive? I don't know. So figuring out that stuff first, I think, is completely invaluable. And I think some of the best advice I've ever received actually was probably from Inti, which is read the documentation.
Yeah, read the docs.
Like some of the most critical bugs are laid out for you in the documentation should you care to read it. Mm-hmm. Just reading it with, that mindset of looking for inconsistencies or things where systems disagree with each other about how some piece of data should be treated.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a really good one. Read the docs and set up stuff the whatever it is by yourself if you can, and play around with it.
Yeah, for open source stuff especially, one of the ways you can really quickly get something up and running these days is with AWS Marketplace. Mm-hmm. So if you need, an F5 big IP load balancer, for example, you can go on Amazon Marketplace and click a few buttons and you've got one running, without having to do anything that's difficult, really, because they want companies to be able to use this stuff as easily as possible. So they've made it easy.
I do have an interesting question to you. How do you react when you find a big vulnerability? What's the first thing that you do? Do you like flip a table? What's going on?
I think probably the first thing is usually go, oh shit. Like that's the genuine reaction. There's a really specific feeling associated with it. It's quite hard to describe. It's kind of a mix of horror and fascination and excitement and disbelief, I think, worked in there as well. It's like sort of a deep pit of the stomach, kind of that should not be doing that kind of a thing, mixed with I might be about to make quite a lot of money.
There's a lot of different feelings, right, going on, a lot of excitement, a lot of craziness.
Yeah, definitely a big kick of adrenaline for sure.
Sweet. I want to ask you a couple of would you rather questions, if you're fine with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm having a couple prepared. I'm just going to shoot with the first one. Would you rather choose a bug bounty program that has a very tiny scope or one that has a super large scope?
I think I'd pretty much always go for the larger scope personally, which I think is probably the thing most people would go for. In my case, I like to explore, and if there's a big scope, that means there's probably lots to explore, mm-hmm. And also tends to increase the chances that if I find something that's kind of a little bit out of scope, that it might still be okay. Because to me, that's a signal of this company is saying, we want to know everything about how we're insecure. And that's not to say a small scope means that companies don't care about that stuff. Some places just generally don't have that much stuff, especially if they're a startup. They've got one domain. Like, that's all we know.
And you have this insane suite of tools that you've written by yourself, so you gotta have a big scope to make good use of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a lot of that is because of the first target that I worked on, and worked on a lot. It was, fairly big scope, some 300-400 hosts or something, or something like that, subdomains and domains and stuff. And it was pretty much a case of everything's in scope, like including some third-party systems where we sort of got an agreement from the third party that they would maybe be receiving some traffic that looks malicious, but probably okay, and paid out on behalf of those third parties almost in a few cases, not stupendous amounts, but you could think of it as they were paying out as we didn't write this software, but we did choose it. And that means we're still responsible for that. So
that's a pretty cool thing to do from like a company perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, limitations to it, of course, but like if you find a 0-day in Apache or something, I'd be like, yeah, that's that's not on us.
Exactly.
But yeah,
I got another question for you. Would you rather search for an SSRF or for an XXE vulnerability?
Ooh, I think I'd rather search for an SSRF. And I think that's probably because I can more easily visualize the situations in which an SSRF would occur. Like if I was on a mission, to find specifically an SSRF, I could think like, okay, so where are there going to be network calls made with a potentially, user control value? So it might be a really obvious one. And they provide a screenshot service where you can screenshot URLs, for example. It's like, that's obviously a place to look. And I think from spending time building software in a service-oriented architecture, I'm personally quite familiar with where those sorts of scenarios crop up.
This is where your software development background comes into play and helps you out a lot.
Yeah, and time spent in solutions architecture as well, which is, so much of that is about stitching together systems that don't want to be stitched together, where a third party hosts one and a different third party built another, and then you have some in-house built software as well. And then there's a data warehousing solution it has to integrate with that was built by a different third party, and you have to stitch these things together, with sticky tape and glue. And you get kind of used to that sort of systems thinking of figuring out how these components stitch together. XXE, on the other hand, is kind of firstly, I don't like XML. XML needs to go away. And part of that is, I think a lot of the places that XXE shows up is in things like Java applications, where, Java's not my strong suit at all. I'm much more at home in a PHP application than I'm in a Java application, just because I spent so long writing PHP applications. But I think, if I'm honest with myself, I think it's probably, I understand SSRF better.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, whatever you feel most comfortable with, that's usually the stuff that you're searching for, right? I do have another one. I know that you're a big fan of Go. But the next question is, would you rather want to build a hacking tool in C or in Rust?
Ooh, that's another tough call, actually. I think if I had to publish it and have people actually use it, then Rust. I would have to learn Rust for the record. But if I actually had to just do it for like personal use and do it now, I'd probably pick C because I don't really know C either, but there's less to learn. It also depends on what the tool does as well.
It's old school and classy, right?
Yeah, and part of me is I've been looking for an excuse to learn C for a long time.
There you go.
So
I'm waiting for your first tool in C now.
Yeah, But also it depends on what the tool does and how complicated it is.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be handling, concurrent HTTP connections, I'm going to pick Rust. But if I don't have to do that sort of stuff, and I'm doing sort of like quite simple single-threaded stuff, then maybe I would pick C for the learning opportunity. But from a memory safety perspective, if I had to be like production ready, I would always pick Rust.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, to the next one. We're getting a little more abstract over here, as you will see in just a bit. Would you rather try to hack a PlayStation or an Xbox?
Ooh.
First thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah. So I'm not a hardware hacker. I think probably a PlayStation.
Yeah.
And I'm basing this off of old, possibly incorrect knowledge that the PlayStation kind of loosely uses BSD somewhere in there. And I'm more comfortable in a Unixy sort of environment than a Windowsy sort of environment that I know that Xbox would be.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, I have one final question for you. Would you rather try to teach your mom how to hack or a class of 10-year-old children?
Ooh, I think I'd rather teach the class of 10-year-old children.
Yeah?
So, no offense to my mom, but I think she wouldn't really be interested. And I think that's interested in what I do and that sort of thing, but not enough to actually learn. 10-year-olds, on the other hand, they're interested in everything.
Yeah.
Or at least some of them are.
And hacking sounds pretty cool, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the thing that gets thrown around in online games, right? Like if someone's really, really good, they go, "Oh, you're a hacker."
Yeah.
Because I don't believe you're that good at the game. You must have hacked it.
Cheater.
So they're familiar. A lot of them are already going to be good with computers. They already understand parts about the web and that sort of thing. But the enthusiasm is the main thing.
Yeah.
Along with not being overburdened with expectations of how things should work or what things should work. So I think one of the things I've noticed about some hackers is there are people who will just try anything. And I think that kind of holds me back occasionally, because the things I won't try because I think I figured out how it works. I go, "Oh, that one works, so I'm going to try it." And then, someone else like Sam Curry shows up, tries it, and it works.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think 10-year-olds are probably really good at that kind of thing. They'll try anything.
Yeah, abstract thinking. They have a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, sometimes it's a case of, throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And they have more shit to throw.
Mm-hmm.
Because, they don't have any preconceptions about what should happen or what should work. I think you need some of that to be able to spot when something breaks. But yeah, I'd definitely pick 10-year-olds.
Yeah, that's a good call there. All right, let's wrap this up. Do you have any shout outs or any words you want to put out to our audience?
I think main thing I want to tell people is to stay curious and learn how things work. I work on the assumption at least some people watching this are people who do hacking and bug bounty and that sort of thing, and maybe even trying to get started. But learn how things work and why they work, and that will help you more than memorizing different exercise payloads or anything like that ever will.
Sweet. All right. Thank you very much, Tom, for being with us on the show today. I will actually put down a link in the description that brings our audience to all of your tools. And yeah, thanks for being here today, and talk to you soon.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again, Tom, for being with us on the show today. And I need you right now. Please let us know down below in the comment section who you want to see next time or in the future on any of our Hacker Heroes episodes. And apart from that, I want to introduce you to the person who's coming up next. And in our next episode, we're going to talk to Bitmap, or real_Bitmap on Twitter, who is actually one of our top 10 hackers on our platform. So you don't want to miss out on that. And with that, make sure to subscribe in the top right corner. And as always, I talk to you soon.